Great. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Development Discourse, where we ideate for Africa's development. My name is Patrick Okigbo, founding partner, Nextier. Nextier is a multi-competency advisory firm focused on solving complex development challenges. My guest today is one of those Nigerians recognized by probably just their first name or initials. Professor Patrick Utomi, or simply Pat to many Nigerians, is a political economy professor and management expert steeped in both theory and praxis. He has about 10 books on the subject. Over the last 4 decades, he has engaged in various initiatives to fix Nigeria, from founding civil society organizations like Concerned Professionals and Center for Values in Leadership, to co-founding Lagos Business School, to running for president of Nigeria. Pat sits on the boards of several Nigerian and international companies. I'm unsure if there's any Nigerian who's more connected than Pat in the business and public policy circles. So there is no one more qualified to discuss our topic for today, which is how reforms succeed and fail. Pat, welcome.
Thank you so very much, Patrick. It's a pleasure to be able to join.
Thank you. And congratulations on your 68th birthday celebrations, which you marked with a full-day policy discourse at the Muson Center yesterday in Lagos, and the public presentation of your latest book, Power, Policy, Politics, and Performance. I mean, this book examines the interactions between senior bureaucrats and politicians to deliver reforms and performance. Perhaps we can start with you presenting the book's core thesis, and then we can frame our conversations around it. Pat.
Well, thank you. Thank you so very much. I think that I found the imperative of getting this book out, flowing out of the frustrations that I have seen around the continent of Africa with why economic growth is slow. You know, for many, many years, I followed the big debate on why growth is slow in Africa. Actually, I recall attending an Aspen Institute France summit in 1996. It was called by former French president, Prime Minister Raymond Barre, who was a professor of economics. And I recall at that meeting, Raymond Barre opened and on the theme was Africa must produce or die. And we had some very interesting conversations. You know, the Aspen Institute Europe-Africa summits were meetings of a select number of leaders from Africa and Europe, a few political leaders, a few, very, very few academics, and a few leading businessmen. My partner at that meeting, sitting next to me in the round, was Blaise Compaoré, who was then president of Burkina. And I think to my left was the then deputy managing director of the IMF, who is now president of Côte d'Ivoire, Alassane Ouattara. So many interesting things about that particular conference. Was a very interesting gentleman from Uganda who was a former foreign minister of Uganda, was in the UN system, Olara Otuno. Lara is a very brilliant mind, and South Africa was just emerging, and Europe was getting very excited about what South Africa would do to stimulate things in Africa. The season was called the season of Afro-pessimism, a time when the world had literally begun to forget about Africa, to think that it just might drop off the cliff somehow and stop being part of the planet. Things were so bad. It was from one war, resource war after another, and coup after another. And so the theme was Africa must produce or die, because central to the problem of Africa was it producing, was it not producing? Well, if you follow the literature around that season, shortly after trying to explain why Africa does not produce, as it were, you will find a number of contending perspectives. But there were two primary perspectives: the so-called geography or destiny argument on the one hand, and the policy argument. There were a number of academics that dominated the so-called destiny argument. Interestingly, Jeff Sachs was a very big part of that, and a number of other people. And the one I actually used to shock MBA students was I said, look, Jeff Sachs says Africa is poor because it was destined to be poor. And they go, what? You know, and I say, look, Jeff Sachs does not hate Africa. In fact, he seems to be inclined to love in Africa. The problem is that he's trying to provide an alibi to African leaders. And so Jeff would argue, for example, that Africa is not growing because of geography. Geography has placed Africa in the tropics. That means mosquitoes are flying around the place. The people are catching malaria. And because they have malaria, productivity is low. They are sick most of the time. And my friend, Paul Collier, who seemed to lead the policy argument, says, hogwash, Jeff is talking nonsense. And I tended to say stuff like that too. And I said, look, hey, Southeast Asian economies, they were the tiger economies of that season. We're in the tropics. Singapore and Lagos are same thing. Kuala Lumpur, you know, so why were they growing and Africa was not? So it's got to be more than geography.
Yeah.
It's got to be certainly much more than geography. And then we went through those debates. I then used to even throw in Israel. Here is Israel in the desert, exporting cut flour and pumpkins and stuff like that every night into Europe. And we are blaming geography? Yeah. Something is wrong somewhere. So I tended to side with Paul Collier in that general conversation of why growth is slow in Africa. And Collier's thesis is that African leaders just had not led.
Yes.
In terms of the policy choices that they were making. In fact, I then went on to write a book that was titled Why Nations Are Poor.
Mm-hmm.
And Why Nations Are Poor try to identify some sets of interdependent variables which work together to lead to economic growth or lack of it. And amongst those variables were policy choices, which plays into the point that Paul was making, that African leaders were making the wrong policy choices. And of course, in terms of thinking policy choices, it was generally, in a simplistic way, between the so-called dirigist thesis of government control and markets. So anyway, policy choices are a critical set of variables. Next one, institutions. Institutions, in my view, have now emerged clearly as a consensus basis for human progress. I watched this begin to emerge. Today, if you read historians like Neil Ferguson, they will write about how institutions separated the West from the rest. You know, civilization, the West versus the rest, or the 6 killer apps of Western power, and so on. Then I had human capital. Very critical part of human capital is about education and healthcare. If people don't have the right education, if they're not dying, then they can create value. And indeed, today we talk about the aristocracy of talent. A part of what separates the West from the rest is the point that Adrian Woolridge, the British journalist, writer, makes in that lovely book, The Aristocracy of Talent. and how it shaped the modern world. And so when you live in Africa, where talent is put down, seriously put down by the shenanigans of leaders, you will know that Africa is going to be challenged. Fourth set of variables is entrepreneurship. You're not going to grow quality of life for people if people are not creating wealth. This has become famous in Nigeria lately with Peter Obi talking about consumption to production. Exactly. Even though I like to preface this every time by saying consumption is not necessarily a bad thing. Exactly. So let's be careful before people begin to think there's something wrong with consumption. Exactly. Some kind of consumption may be problematic, but you have to produce anyway to consume. When you produce, then consumption can stimulate production. Becomes great. You know,
in fact, you seek ways to stimulate consumption.
Absolutely. Yeah. You know, so then there's the almighty variable called culture. Values shape human progress, and my intro into how values shape human progress is to go to a man I was enormously a great fan of, let's put it that way. When I was a grad student in the US, I would abandon a class to watch proceedings in the US Senate, waiting for him to talk. A former Harvard professor that has your name, Daniel Patrick Moynihan.
Yeah.
Moynihan made a profound statement many years ago. And he was asked a very simple question. You know, you ask him a small question and then you get a book. You know, what's the difference between Democrats and Republicans? I said, well, you know, Democrats are liberals. Republicans are conservatives. A lot of people from outside say, what's the difference? Americans are all the same. Democrat, what's the difference? The Democrat and they're all capitalists. It says, well, there are some governing truths of these liberals and conservatives. It says the central conservative truth is that it is not politics, but culture that is responsible for the progress of a society. Exactly. Which is why Republicans will talk about family values and these and these, you know, work ethic and so on and so forth. It says, but the central liberal truth is that politics can change a culture and save it from itself.
Exactly.
So,
which he tried to do throughout his career, right?
That's what his life was about. Yeah. You know, I mean, when I think of Moynihan, the day I heard him talk about the problems of urban America,
yes,
using a term from medicine, you know, when a doctor is responsible for the problem that is, you know, does more harm to the patient.
Yes.
Iatrogenic. Yes. You know, when the patient dies more from the doctor's treatment than from the ailment he was trying to treat. Iatrogenic medicine. Yeah. Discuss urban policy in America. That's iatrogenic choice process. And that day I just went cuckoo in my apartment. You know, so Moynihan basically made that statement, and it became the basis of a colloquium at Harvard during the year that I spent there writing the book, Managing Uncertainty. And that colloquium was on how values shape human progress. Phenomenal thing. It was captured in a book that was edited after that by Lawrence D. Harrison and Samuel P. Huntington Jr. That's titled Culture Matters. And basically, I mean, there's so many fantastic presentations of that colloquium, but one of my favorites really that makes the point about culture and how important culture is when this group of Harvard Business School professors started the Monitor Company. Remember the Monitor Company?
Yes,
consulting firm. I think somebody just acquired it some years ago, but you know, Michael, another Michael, I think who was the managing partner, spoke at that conference, and the question was why Colombia was not making economic advance. Colombia produces leather goods. So went to the value chain, starts in America, ask people, why are you not buying these bags and shoes from Colombia? Then quality is poor. So they go back to the guys who manufacture it. Why is your quality poor such that people are not buying it? Well, the kind of hides and skin that we get from the distance is one kind. This kind of leather is not really making it. They go back to the farmers, the ranchers. Why is the leather so poor? It's, you see, these our cows are very stupid. They go to the barbed wire and they're scratching their body. Conclusion, Colombia is poor because your cows are stupid. So, and you really see where culture comes in. Values shape human progress. Yeah. There's so many things I look at in Nigeria and I just go, oh dear. Nigerian politicians are the reason Nigeria is poor. But they don't realize it. They don't do it out of wickedness. They do it out of foolishness. You know, I mean, look at a country that is in terrible existential crisis. People are struggling to live. They're upset with this, they're upset with that. Their politicians are not intelligent enough to even realize that this is a time to stop any consumption that is exhibiting in its nature. Yes. Now you're going to buy Prado. The Zambian I said to you, if you want to buy Prado, buy it with your own money, no problem. Because one senator came on television. When I heard it, I switched off my TV. That he used to drive a better car than who the hell cares what he used to drive? Fly in a jet. But heck, public money, you go in a Toyota Corolla. Yes. You know, let me tell you why culture is so important. I remember when I think it was Don Regan, one of those Reagan executives, took a helicopter to go and play golf. Huh? If you see the hell that was raised about it, one cabinet secretary was going to give a talk somewhere, I don't know, in Middle America or somewhere. He wanted to go with Colorado, you know. So he wanted to go with his wife. So he bought his wife ticket. They flew there, but he did not want any trouble. When they arrived in Washington, they were going home together. Wife, take a cab. Enter the government car to drop me at home. The cab was following the car. That's culture. You recognize it's a public resource and should be treated as a public resource, not your private thing to do anything you like with. But the Nigerian politician doesn't think like that. He thinks that it is his business to make the public treasury his personal bank or piggy bank. So culture matters. So who sets the tone of culture? Leaders. That's why leadership is important. The reason we talk about leaders, the reason character is critical to progress is because leaders set the tone of culture. If you don't have character, how can you set the tone of culture that will be progressive and lead people to progress? So, and when I again like to illustrate this with motto of a school in Owerri, called Government Secondary School Owerri. I think a motto is something like work hard, pay hard. When wealth is lost, nothing is lost. When health is lost, something is lost. When character is lost, all is lost. Correct. And again, 20 years or so ago, I used to teach using that comment or that motto. And I would tell them, look, example, when wealth is lost, nothing is lost. Because, you know, you can make money, lose it, make money again, lose it. People keep making money every day and you can come and go. And this American billionaire was coming out of the subway in New York. And I was on video, and I will play the video in class. And he looks at this homeless guy begging for money at the subway station. And he says, my goodness, this guy is worth much more than me. At the very worst, he's worth zero. I am worth far less than zero. A couple of years later, that man was back a billionaire. Indeed, he ended up president of the United States of America. Donald J. Trump. Now, and I said, well, Look, this guy who changed the world with his technology, Steve Jobs, in the prime of his life, health hit, and he was no more. He had enough money to pay 10 people to die for him, and they would take the money. But unfortunately, when health is lost, something is lost. Character. When character is lost, it's all gone. I mean, people are debating every day. The problem with development in Nigeria, this. I said, look, Nigeria has lost character. When you lose character, the world does not want to deal with you. Until Nigerian politicians can understand that, we're not going anywhere. So anyway, bottom line is leaders set the tone of culture. And these sets of variables determine whether a nation is rich or poor. And if you want to do comparisons, my friend Peter Lewis did it yesterday, between India's trajectory since 1999 and Nigeria's trajectory. Same Peter, Professor Peter Lewis, wrote a book many years ago titled Growing Apart.
Nigeria and Ghana.
Which compared Nigeria and Indonesia.
Indonesia, yeah.
Indeed, in the early 60s, they used to say to Indonesia, we wish you would be like Nigeria. By the 1990s, they were saying to Nigeria, we wish you could be like Indonesia. So these variables, which define human progress, in my view, became central issues for looking at the trajectory of travel of a country. And basically, when you found yourself falling behind others, you wanted to review what it was that was responsible. Sometimes it's forced on you from outside because of the nature of the international trading system. And this is the point that Joseph Stiglitz tried to make in Globalization and Its Discontents. You can export inflation from your country to other trading partners. You can all kinds of things. So that's why the IMF exists. Bretton Woods institutions were created as World War II was coming towards an end to deal with one of the causes of war. If you look at the history of war, amongst the things that led to big wars, where first of all, you get some misbehavior in some economic relations. Then people begin to apply, after globalization, trade has led to increase in wealth and people are enjoying their wealth. Then people begin to go to beggar thy neighbor policies to protect their economy from these people from outside. And those invariably reduce trade, increase poverty, increase irritation. And one man just says, you stupid prince. Me, you're calling me prince stupid. And the world is at war. So to avoid that kind of foolishness, it was important, therefore, to ensure that there was some kind of policing to help people manage their economies. If you have problems, they can. That's what the IMF was created for. And Joe Stiglitz's major critique of it in Globalization and Its Discontents, that IMF forgot its role and became the policeman banker for Western banks that made the wrong policy choices, the wrong lending choices. So anyhow, these pressures to reform either come from those kinds of institutions, that's why you have IMF conditionalities, or they come from your realization that you need to improve the way things are, because if so many people are hungry, one day they will cut your neck off. You know, the famous video going around about this Ugandan guy, about the rich cannot sleep because the poor are awake, and the poor are awake because they are hungry. So the causal effect then leads you to, we want to change things. So how do we change these things? And then all kinds of reforms are initiated. The question is, why have those reforms failed? Many of them have failed, including the grand reforms that came out of the IMF World Bank system that was called the Structural Adjustment Program. Why did they fail? Why did they not achieve what was proposed? Well, there are a variety of excuses and quasi reasons. I think that these have not been adequately interrogated. And one of the biggest reasons why reforms have failed is that the most critical play in the reform process is kind of avoided. Now, my very dear sister, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, tried to lead one of those reforms during the Obasanjo-Jonathan administrations. She was so frustrated with it all, she wrote a book about it.
Mm-hmm.
And what was the name of the book? The name of the book tells
Reforming the Unreformable. Mm-hmm.
Unreformable. Was it unreformable? Perhaps not. What was the problem was how was the reform introduced?
Yes.
First of all, many of the people who they were trying to reform were so resentful of these foreign do-gooders or these Nigerian exports just jumping. You're enjoying life at the World Bank and traveling around the world. One day, jump into Nigeria, want to teach us how to behave. That's the starting point of resistance. Now, let me take Nigerian history and provide one illustration of the reform of that process of this interaction. I generally like to begin with that because it fascinated me when I first came across it. And I, of course, had the privilege of knowing the principal actors in that and several of the ones that have happened since. In 1957, Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe was Premier of Eastern Region. He was very much, impassioned about education. He wanted Eastern Region to leapfrog in education relative to southwest of Nigeria, what was called Western Region, where universal basic primary education was free already. So he said, we're introducing universal basic free education, whatever it is, in Eastern Region. Jerome Udoji had just become permanent secretary in the Ministry of Finance. And Udoji's team reviewed revenues and blah, 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 blah. And they said, hey, okay, Premier, it's not possible. We can't afford it. And please don't do that. The usual things, everybody waded in. The British guy who was chief secretary, whatever, the head of service, or whatever, told the young Udoji to please just take a leave, go to London, cool off, and come back. Before Udoji got to London, John Holt had a letter of appointment for him to be an executive director. And, Udoji definitely wanted to leave. His wife and many people of Eastern Region prevailed on him that this would not be good for the Igbo people, whatever. Anyway, Zeke certainly found a way of apologizing without losing face, and Udoji returned to Enugu as permanent secretary. So what then happens? Eastern Region decides to look for a creative way to allow itself full power in education without necessarily blowing the budgets because they didn't have the resources. Bunu, Ibuani, Danda. How do we share the burden of making education really happen? That's how the Igbo State Union became perhaps one of the biggest educating bodies in the country, setting up secondary schools across the country, not just in Eastern Region. The missions, their own agenda was raised. By the time you combined community, Igbo State Union, education rocketed up in Eastern Region. The goals achieved from a different path. And that's why creativity in policy making remains so important. But for that to happen, you have to have a certain understanding of that nexus between the public bureaucracy and the political class. And let me just, because time is going quickly, advance this to a central theorizing around this.
Around the book, yes.
In Latin America, an Argentine scholar called Guillermo O'Donnell, looking at modernization back in the 60s and 70s, concluded that what was going on was that the political and bureaucratic elites, in Brazil was a classic example, were creating an excluding coalition in which they focused on modernization. Please, you funny politicians, don't get involved in this. We developmentally minded technocrats we tough soldiers, we modernize. And he called that process bureaucratic authoritarianism. So question is, you have to examine the nature of the processes in these countries. And how do you enable that coalition to become a developmental coalition? And one of the things you find in Nigeria, the Nigerian state has stopped being a developmental state. And Mano Edeyiche focuses remarkably on this, both with his work in South Africa and the more recent book on Nigeria, because it would seem, and Peter Lewis, in his book that is coming soon, he touches on it, that the Nigerian political class, by 1999, came to an agreement, let's find a way of keeping the military out and share the booty, the rents that are available in Nigeria. And somehow, in that trade, in those transactions, development of the Nigerian people dropped off the table. So it became government of politicians, for politicians, by politicians.
Exactly.
And that's why Nigeria has not been developing. Okay. I know you've been trying to get me to stop, so let me stop there.
No, so I mean, so the core thesis of the book is, finding a way for the bureaucratic elite and the political elite to work together towards development, right? Now,
yes, that's central.
Yes.
But you have to understand both and the process to be able to do that.
And then you went through and looked at the different epochs, governance epochs in Nigeria, the colonial, the constitutional, and what we have now, the democratic. But I think the bigger question for me is, in a society where it appears that the elites have conspired to take care of themselves and forget about development, which means that they also control all the institutions and levers that can push them out, which also means that the people are so poor that they can't really do anything about it. How do you then fracture or split that elite such that it begins to work for the people?
Yeah, well, you see, yes, that is only for a season and that's why the concept of legitimacy is so important in my conversation. When the elites do that, they begin to lose legitimacy. And what is legitimacy? And I want to separate legality from legitimacy. They talk a lot of nonsense about Supreme Court judge, this, that. That's about legality. What matters is legitimacy. Do the people accept that you have a breathing right to leading them? And legitimacy, one of the best discussions of legitimacy comes from Simon Martin Lipset and the First New Nation, the American political sociologist. And legitimacy is earned every day. It's not because I've won this election, who voted for me. The next day, if their lives get worse, the votes they cast stop having legitimating value. And so this is why Western politicians are constantly looking at the polls and tracking themselves, because legitimacy is earned every day. Nigerian politicians don't think legitimacy. They play games with legality. That's why a person who came forth in an election will end up as and try to govern. When you don't have legitimacy, you really can't govern. You can impose yourself in military rule. They had to earn some legitimacy to be able to be effective. As powerful as all the guns and everything made them, they still couldn't govern unless they found some way. So if your legitimacy continues to depreciate because you don't govern for the people, one day you get to Somalia.
Not to cut him, but I feel like the people get to a point where they really cannot do much, right? So take Nigeria, for instance. We're really a poor nation. We're a day pay nation. 90% or so of us must go out every day to feed, which means that we can't sustain public demonstration for more than a few days. We've got to go back to where we earn our living, right? In that case, is it the masses who will fix the country, or is it like a middle class? Now, Nigeria does not have a middle class either. So isn't it at the elite level that something must happen at the elite level where a faction of the elite breaks away? Isabella Mears, in her Protecting the Ballot, calls it elite split, right? That splits and says, okay, we're going to fight for this for our own selfish interest, But in
absolutely.
fact, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. You see, think of the so-called miracle tiger economies of Asia. Some elements within the elite realized that it was their long-term undoing going the way things were going. Now, you take Malaysia, Singapore example. This ambitious young Singaporean called Lee Kuan Yew back in those days feels his country cannot survive except it was sucked into a coalition with the bigger North, the Malay dominant nation called Malaysia. And so they went into a federation. These Malay politicians, just the way Nigerian politicians try to exclude Nigerians who think. Nigerian politics is so bankrupt because their main mission is to prevent people who think from being in the political process, so that they can, because they think it gets in the way of the mess that they make. The Malay politicians were worried about this too clever, ambitious boy from Singapore. So they ejected Singapore from the Federation in 1965. And Lee breaks down and weeps literally because he thinks it's the end. Then he puts on a thinking cap. And what happens? Before you know it, Singapore is surging and surging forward. And Malaysia looks around the corner. Hey, what's going on there? Meanwhile, Mahathir ibn Mohamad, this mulatto doctor, who was giving them trouble in the cabinet, says to the prime minister, everything give and take, give and take. Where is he giving? Always he's the taking. And they say, this rascal, expel him from the party. So they expel him from the party. They remove him as a junior minister. And he goes out and writes a book titled The Malay Dilemma.
Exactly.
And this leads to riots and all kinds of stuff. And Tun Abdul Razak resigns as prime minister. Mahathir returns to the party, UMNO, United Malay National Organization. Mahathir eventually ends up as prime minister. For his own survival, and he's looking across the border. Malaysia begins a process. We know where it led Malaysia. I think invariably that a section of an elite, either out of a certain sense of self or whatever it is that compels it, chooses to commit class suicide within the rent culture. And that section of elite is the one that forces out these characters whose whole thing is about how much rent they're extracting from the system. And those characters eventually find that they even do better in this new order because the cake is being baked. So there's a lot more of it.
Yeah. What's the process for sequencing this to happen? Say in Nigeria, how do you trigger that split that then leads to a section of the elite focusing more on development and focusing on driving reforms that can then lead to performance?
You see, I'm not sure that there is a formula. If there were a formula, everybody would have looked for it, bought it, and propelled it. But history is a very amazing thing. The moments just happen. You can miss the opportunity and you are lost, unfortunately, and you may be able to pick up on it. But one of my favorite examples of how the unexpected happens, it goes back to World War II. Germans, of course, occupying France. Allied forces have landed in Normandy and setting stage for their push into Europe. And there's a German general called von Kulitz, who is commander in Paris. And Hitler decides, okay, let's reduce Paris to ruble, and gives the order to von Kulitz and says, burn down Paris. And von Kulitz puts on his uniform, goes before his mirror and says, why should history remember me as the man who destroyed the most beautiful city in the world?
Exactly.
And he sends a message to the Allied forces that he wouldn't defend Paris, they should come in and take it. Eisenhower forces think it's a trap, so they ignore it. Hitler hears that Paris was not burning, calls him, he says, is Paris burning? And Kulitz realizes that he is in trouble, sends a message again. And the Allies basically think, and then this Frenchman called Charles de Gaulle, leading these ragtag French forces, pre-French forces, hears it. I said, what are you talking? And he drives into Paris with no reinforcement and takes Paris for nothing. You know, I just have a feeling that the kind of rascals that occupy the space today, driven by self-interest, egos, all kinds of things, and one of them will just decide, hey, why should I be remembered as people who kept his children and grandchildren in perennial poverty? And something happens.
Fantastic, fantastic, fantastic. Now let's come down to maybe, whilst we're waiting for that to happen, we still have to find ways to keep working on reforms and keep chasing performance. There's an often repeated maxim, so to speak, that Nigeria's problem is not good ideas, but implementation. I have always struggled with that, but increasingly I hear that in even knowledgeable company. What do you think of that?
You know, the way it used to be put is that, you know, it's good policies, not good policies, not the problem. We have good policies. The problem is we have bad implementation. That's an oxymoron. A good policy takes into account implementability. If you cannot implement it, it's not good policy.
Thank you.
You know, back in my days in grad school in the 70s, called Jeffrey Pressman. And Jeff Pressman wrote a book titled Implementation. And what is implementation? Part of the point he tries to make. He said implementation is about changing attitude to how you do things. And I'm glad my friend Professor Utomi is just written a book that development as attitude. If you are going to change attitude, and you say to people, to be able to get from Victoria Island to Surulere very fast, we need to asphalt roads and coming out. But there is somebody who says to them that the gods of Lagos have something against black things. If you go on that black thing, something will happen to I don't know what. And so you've started the road, but people don't use the road. They go into the bush to try and get to Surulere. What's the point of tarring the road?
Yeah.
So development, managing change is about changing attitude. And you cannot change attitude unless the people and the policymakers embrace each other and realize that they have a common destiny. And the essence of this policy is to improve everybody's lot. The idea of the common good of all is not religion. The common good of all is common sense. And so policy implementation begins with creating shared values between the citizens about what path to travel for human progress. And that's the most important role that politicians play in society, convincing others that this is the way that we can all together have a better future. When they begin to do that, and people begin to embrace that, you will find that you can more effectively, quote unquote, implement that policy. But to tell me that there is a good policy and bad implementation is absolute nonsense. You don't understand what you're talking about.
Thank you for that. And we'll get into a bit of a conversation on the how, how to make reforms succeed. But one question before we get there is, how much do you attribute our failures in the country to the fact that we haven't rigorously debated our development philosophy? Yeah. An example here is the last 8 years. I'm not sure what system we practiced. I'm not sure if we practiced a liberal capitalist system, or if it was a socialist Marxist system, or if it was a mix. And that leads to a lot of confusion. Take, for instance, the power sector, right? Is power a commodity that must be paid for, or is it a social good that must be given to people? So to what extent is this lack of rigor in a debate on our development philosophy part of the reasons why we're not able to implement reforms?
Well, it's a very, very important part of why we have not succeeded so far. I was talking about Jean-Louis Ekra, former Afri-Exim Bank president. He and I were having a dinner some years ago when he was president. He said to me that the most frustrating thing about Africa is the African elite who make bombastic comments about things they have no information about. Oh, look at that man. He stole everything in that company. He said, how did he steal it? I don't know. Somebody in the bus was passing and said he stole everything in the company. This is a very serious man, you know. And I can give you a personal example. Very important person, you know, in this country, chief executive of major parastatal. Wife comes to ask me some favor relating to the Lagos Business School, which I was part of getting going. And I started to tell you the story of Lagos Business School. Started with zero, absolute zero, no money. How we're using a room in somebody's living room to do the first seminars. Yeah. She was so easy. Huh? I thought it was the money you made from Volkswagen that you used. I was in shock. I couldn't believe somebody would make that kind of statement. I said to her, first of all, the day I left Volkswagen, there was not more than 102,000, including my gratuity or whatever it was I was paid in my account. Wife of this MD of a major parastatal in the former MD of Post Authority. Let me just put it that way. He wanted me to do something at the Lagos Business School, and I was trying to explain how school started with zero capital and, you know, the grit that went to building it. I thought it was the money you made from Volkswagen that you used. I said, why? I never heard that before. But you can imagine what's in the heads of people and what they're saying. So I said to her, when I left Volkswagen, there was less than 100,000 naira in my accounts anywhere in the world. And she was looking stunned. And it reminded me of a day I was in traffic. That day I was so broke, I was just thinking, how am I going to survive? I don't even have 5,000 naira anywhere in my pocket. I see a magazine, the richest man in Nigeria. I saw this person. I recognized a name I knew. Obalashore made this list. Then I look and I see my name. I say, oh, Barry. me with less than 5,000 naira in my account.
Let me I mean, we're having a lot of technical issues here. Number one, I don't know if we should turn off our videos, and that would save a bit of bandwidth, and maybe that would help.
Okay.
You know, which is a terrible way to do this.
Sure, I'm willing on the fact that we don't have rational public conversation in Nigeria, and that's a very difficult thing to build on. Yeah. Okay,
so again, if you could crystallize for us, you know, what are some of the key success factors to ensure we can drive reforms in Nigeria, right? I know that there is no one rule playbook for it, you know, but are there some critical success factors, especially in the context of Nigeria's political economy, that we should seek to put in place in designing and implementing reforms?
Yeah, well, first of all, you need some committed stakeholders. You know, one of the pains I have with the Nigerian Economic Summit Group process is a very important process, but was supposed to be stronger than it worked out to be. You know, in 1985, there was a conference in Nairobi that was sponsored by the Aga Khan Foundation. It dealt with the idea of a tripartite approach to development. That conference was attended by senior Nigerians from the public sector, private sector, and the NGO sector, if you will call it that. And the conference talked about the PDAs, private development agencies, and public sector and private sector. Chief Ernest Shunekon, who was then chief executive of UAC, one of the biggest companies in the country at the time, went from the private sector. From the public sector, Alhaji Abubakar Alhaji, AAA, who was Federal PAMSEC in finance, led the public sector delegation, I believe. And one Dr. Jack from the PDA, Private Development Agency sector. And this conference talked about how a balanced view of development can crystallize from partnership between these three sectors.
Mm-hmm.
After the conference, the people who attended called a meeting that brought in some more people and founded what we then called the Enabling Environment Forum.
Mm-hmm.
The person who managed that process was a remarkable gentleman called Udo Uwakaneme. Udo is still alive, I believe. He lives in his hometown now in Arochukwu or thereabouts. It was this Enabling Environment Forum that got private sector people, public sector people to begin to dialogue on how policy can be better and serve everybody much better. Then the chair of that group became accidentally head of government, Chief Ernest Shunekon.
Exactly.
And he then called a Nigerian Economic Summit using the framework of the Enabling Environment Forum. That then became the NESG, Nigerian Economic Summit Group. I speak with the authority of presence because the key presentation at both the first and second Nigerian Economic Summits, I was involved as a presenter. Yeah, I was Diolawi of Dunlop and myself, I think, who made the presentation. I worked with the then CEO of Michelin, a French gentleman, on our sector and all of that. My regret is that we allowed the public sector to take on a driver's seat with the NESG. Look, these bloody public sector guys are paid by us. We tell them. And in slipping into a vassal role, the NESG lost it for me. And I've said this publicly several times. I mean, for 17 years, the only one I've attended was the Silver Jubilee Anniversary one, just as a symbol, token thing. Because if we had gone into that and we are telling government what it should do, well, not in a dictatorial way, but hey, we are partners. This is how our country can make more progress. The NGO sector, this is what they can best do for us. This is how they can hold government accountable. This is how this can happen. And as partners, we build a great country. But you get some nincompoop who has become a politician come and talk to you anyhow because he has been appointed a minister. Sense. I don't accept that.
Yeah.
You know?
So what other factors? So that's one. So some idea I've been playing around with is we tend to like the grandiose, we tend to like, the big announcements, but we haven't delivered on any of these big announcements. Shouldn't that be a red flag? Shouldn't we instead focus on smaller bite-sized things we can drive, build muscle memory on how to deliver on anything at all, before we begin to take on these big things. So if a government begins to announce big things, maybe it's a sign it's not going to work. Maybe it's a sign for all of us to start shouting, narrow it down. What do you think of that idea?
You know, Patrick, I think that there are many ways to skin a cat. Not that I want to say a cat, but there are many ways to skin a cat. There's nothing that prevents us from doing what in the NESG was called low-hanging fruits and working on those and all of that. But audacity is also the essence of life. Some audacious plunge can galvanize everybody and move society in a particular direction. This is what happened in Dubai or UAE, for example. It was audacious, and the audacity of it provided momentum for what Dubai has become.
Yeah, but you know, okay, so I'll leave that. I'm sure everywhere I've had this argument, it's been, you know, arguments on both sides of it, and there are pros and cons, as with most things. But I've got a question from a Bushra Balogun, and he says, thank you, Prof, for the clarification on what a good policy really translates to. Would you say that it's the fault when creating these policies? Is it the lack of a human-centered approach or lack of the basic knowledge of public policy by the creators of the policies? So is it that we don't focus on the humans?
Yeah. First of all, I think that is important. I don't know how we missed that. You were going towards ideology when you talked about the last 8 years and all of that. First of all, it's because of the failure of the political party system in Nigeria. You see, a political party basically begins with a set of ideas from which ideation around problem solving can flow. People like to use the word ideology. Ideology, what makes some people nervous. Ideas. If you go back to Charles Lindblom's remarkable book, Politics and Markets, about the socio-economic political systems of the world, which was about ideology, what is socialist, what is Marxist, what is capitalist, was this remarkable book he wrote back in the 70s, I think. You can pigeonhole bodies of ideas of how you organize to solve society's problems. I don't think that a political party has meaning if it doesn't have to be called capitalist or socialist or that. If it doesn't have a certain frame of understanding of how you solve problems. Because what political party is about competing in alternative frames of how you solve problems. Some people might have what you may call a welfarist social Fabian socialism approach. And again, if you want to go back to British politics and how the Fabians, a group of intellectuals, arose in England, and to change England, they were going to do two things essentially: create an institution that would be generator of those ideas, and they founded the London School of Economics, and create a political party that would drive those. They founded the Labour Party, and so many people don't know the link between LSE and Labour Party, and the dominance of the thoughts of someone like Harold Lasky in that area, but it's linked to the way the party evolved. Now, because we don't have any sets of ideas in these parties, in fact, in this book that I've just written, one of my most fascinating points is one made by a former head of service, Professor Falabi. Says civil servants just show up these days. They don't come to work, they just show up. Because the political parties don't come with any set of ideas about where they want society to go. So they say there's a conference in Paris. Everybody begins to plan for conference. Everybody rushes up to Paris. So civil servants are just traveling around the place until one day somebody from their village is powerful enough to make them palm sec and then they go and begin to look for how much resources of the federal government they can bring to their people. You can't build a country like that. And Professor Falabi was dead right. So if the political parties had a certain worldview, what the Germans would call a Weltanschauung, and they then within those sets of worldviews reduce certain social problems to some strategies. And on the basis of this, as they are coming in, everybody from PAMSEC to level 8 knows what they must be doing for the government to get to where it is going. So without this, they sit around and we don't get anywhere. So come back to your main thrust of question. You need to have a disciplined system of ideation that focuses on problems for these problems to be solved appropriately. So Mr. Balogun's question proper spoke to what, there was a part of it, that's nuanced that I wanted to pick up, but I just forgot. Can you read the question again if you don't mind?
1 second, let me pull it up. I think it's probably the part where he says, is it the lack of a human-centered approach or the lack of the basic knowledge of public policy by the creating of the policies?
Public policy. Yeah. It's not because of lack of basic knowledge, it's a matter of rigor.
Yeah.
The process is not rigorous enough for them to find solution. Hey, the big boss is here himself.
Yes, I saw that Professor Olokba raised his hand, and you referenced him quite extensively.
Quite a number of times in the book.
Yes, and I thought we should bring him in to make a comment. But before I bring him in, just to mention that on March 20th, I'll be having a chat with Salisu Muhammad, formerly of the APC, internal party politics and internal democracy within the party, and how to build up political parties in Nigeria to become more effective. But Professor Olokba, you've got the floor.
Thank you very much. I hope you are hearing me.
I can hear you, sir. We can hear you.
Yes, I'd like to congratulate Professor Patrick Utomi.
I can hear you. I can hear you. Yes.
Yes, I'd like to congratulate you for the book. I've not seen it, but I'm looking anxiously to getting my copy. But I just joined, but I picked a bit of the conversation, and I just thought to weigh in on some of the issues that we're building up. Whether we like it or not, whether we are referencing Plato, philosopher King, the old theory that democracy is the rule of oligarchy, or the role of elite in the rise and fall of civilization, I think elite nationalism will still be extremely essential for us to, get a better handle on the leadership, that sophistication that we require to salvage the Nigeria project. I always thought that in spite of all that might be said about poor elite nationalism, the prebenda culture, and all. I thought that there's sufficiently critical mass enough of elite in Nigeria who are sufficiently driven by heroism for us to get the right kind. The challenge really is that very few people, elites in the political class, managed to graduate from being just elite to really being in the political class. And you have put a finger on a lot of the sociological issues, the constraint. I accept your argument regarding the failure of political party system. Our political parties needs to be a lot more sophisticated, more ideological, and more democratic, internal democracy, and to be able to really attract the right core of technocratically minded, professionals who really love to also contribute to national development. I also see that the failure of the political party system makes it difficult to really prepare our leaders for leadership. The mentorship, the intergenerational mentorship. When I read Thatcher's the memoir, and I see how she grew, within the party to the level of becoming a prime minister. You see that it takes a lot of preparation to really occupy a real political position. But what we have here is that people just generally find themselves technically unprepared. The last thing I thought was missing in the political parties. Every political party that is serious needs to have a strong back end of think tanks. The Democratic Party in the United States has the Brookings Institution, the Republican and the American Enterprise Institute and all. Then, of course,
and Hoover at Stanford.
Heritage, so many of them.
Yeah.
There's so many of them,
Yeah. So for me, there is a significant number of people who could take a gamble on development as a form of unique brand of class suicide to drive transformational journey with some heroism, noblesse oblige, if you will. So there is also the fact that there is a factor of the institution. I've had to work with a lot of serious-minded ministers who really wanted to make a whole lot of difference. But really, they are coming with strong technocratic knowledge, but really found that the bureaucracy was not enabling, to activate the force of a capable state. Yes. The kind that the likes of we find in the success story of Awolowo and Adebo, or what the super permanent secretary managed to do. So going forward, I like to say that really it has to be a balance of the strong men, and we've had a couple of them that are really development minded. And if the back end of institution is sufficiently strong and enabling, even in spite of all the drive towards personalizing or achieving some personal objective, they are able to. I'd like to say that the politicians don't really recognize how much of a drawback it is to have a less than professional civil service. When Thatcher came to power in 1979, because of her experience being in different cabinet, shadow cabinet, she made a decision to reform the bureaucracy because she knows that if she can get the bureaucracy right, that she's likely to have done the half of the job. Yes. And she invested in that dynamics. The same thing we found in Japan with the Ministry of Investment, Trade, and
industry.
So really, the whole issue about the building strong institution that could even provide a kind of checkmate that the American institution provided for people like Donald Trump. Even when you are going wrong, you will be able to activate the value-based foundation.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Let me pause.
Thank you, Professor Lott.
Well done.
Yes, thank you. And your most recent book, The Unending Quest for Reforms, is a book that anyone who's interested in these topics should seek to get. Professor Utomi, we have a question from an Obi Emekekwe from New York, and he says, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation, Pat. My concern is that most of the discussions take place with people who are not directly involved in the implementation of policy. How do you think we can get the policy implementers to engage more effectively in the required change to drive the country's development?
Well, thanks. It goes back to the same question about political parties, because it's really what the role of political parties is: to socialize a generation into a certain worldview that they approach the solving of social problems with. And so you can then have contending. Look, you join the Conservative Club as a high school student in the UK, and you get to Oxford, and you have the Conservative Club, the whatever club. And by the time you are graduating, you are grounded in some fundamental, philosophical perspectives on how to solve certain kinds of problems. And then political campaigns are supposed to be about taking those issues to the streets. Look, South Korea essentially solved its political problem when, back in the day when they had politics was like Nigeria, in Godfathers and all those kinds of things. And they were like, how do we solve this problem? And their INEC equivalents decided that, look, one way to deal with this issue is through debates. You cannot hold any office in South Korea if you don't debate on the streets, in classrooms, in gyms, on TV. And the Godfathers ran away because they couldn't do that. Only people who could think continue in politics. And we can see the effect in South Korea today.
Exactly.
Exactly.
In fact, just as an aside, when Buhari became president in 2015, my firm Nextier published a paper where we outlined for him how to select his ministers. And we suggested, slightly tongue-in-cheek, that he should have them debate on TV for the different portfolios, they wanted to be appointed to. Obviously, that did not get a lot of traction, but we've got maybe two more questions as we get into the last 5 minutes of this session. So one is from Juliana Stoyanova. Faith-based organizations play an important role in the lives of Nigerians. Can they have a more pronounced role in solving Nigeria's development problems? The second one is from Atinuke Odenima. So you mentioned the rational public conversations in Nigeria is poor. May I ask who should or who is responsible to hold these conversations? Should it be the public, private, or the civil society organizations? So
let me start with Tinuke's question.
Yeah.
And it's everybody. I mean, I listen on radio. We have this school debates thing. One particular station is making a lot of, generating a lot of whatever buzz. We have what we call the tyranny of drivers, as I call it. You get into a car, your driver chooses the station he wants you to listen to and turns the radio on, and you just listen. So the tyranny of my driver is that I listen to one particular station, and they're promoting these debates among secondary schools quite a bit. So that's a contribution, a huge contribution. Civil society organizations need to play a very important role. Politics is too important to be left to politicians. So everybody, literally speaking, needs to get involved in that. About faith-based organizations, they do have their value. I mean, they influence people so much in this culture that if the pastors were to get a proper education on some of these issues and were to use the pulpit to advance a better understanding of some of those, it will be great for development. The question is how to structure doing it. I'll give you an example. Years ago, Pastor Paul Adifarasin wrote a book on change. And he invited me to read the book and do a critique of it, and then invited me to speak about it in his church. I went a couple of times to do that. The only problem was I went to visit one retired general once, and as I entered, he was trying to introduce me to the daughter. He said, I know him. He's a pastor in our church. I said, oh dear. I said, which church? He said, Pastor Francis Church. I said, okay. So anyway, in spite of drawbacks like that, you can go work well.
Yeah. So again, like with everything in public policy, there are positives and negatives, because the role of the religious institutions, again, if one is not careful, could lead to certain other challenges. But we've got another question in the last 2 minutes or so from Jesse Dinju. Beyond the implementation of public policy, equally critical is the process of developing public policy that is scientific, objective-based. When public policy is not developed from empirical realities, evidences, implementation of such policies become impracticable. How do you think the politics of sidelining social scientists, researchers, like the prof by the political elite, affect the public policy development and by extension, its implementation? I think you kind of already spoke to this, but maybe it's just to underline it. Prof.
Yeah, I mean, really, one of the, and then Professor Olokba also spoke to it in some ways. The difference between the Ziks and the Awolowos of this world and the Sadawanas and today's politicians, if you look at people around them, they were usually intellectuals. Chief Awolowo, Professor Luko. And you turn to Zik and you see the Okigbos, and so on and so forth. You turn to today, all people around them are pimps. So how do they come up with interesting ideas other than how to have a party?
Yeah.
So we have a fundamental problem. We've got to change the culture of politics in Nigeria.
Yeah.
Academics, intellectuals have a very important role. And there's another important thing that we've lost now, which Americans do very well at, the oscillation of elites. In the book, I start about my own experience. I mean, my dean, Charles Bonza, he just came back from Washington. He was Assistant Secretary of State for whatever to Otis Bowen, who was then Health and Human Services Secretary. And they were considering him to return in the Reagan administration at the time I was writing my dissertation to be Office of Management and Budget. Eventually, he didn't get the position. But academics, I saw my teachers take off, go to Washington, serve 2-3 years in an administration, and then move to Wall Street and come back to university. So you had this oscillation of elites that enriched the United States' capacity for making choice. Exactly. In Nigeria, we don't have it, unfortunately.
Exactly. So there's a question on where to get the book. It came out yesterday, I'm sure, by Bookcraft. I'm sure Bookcraft is going to get it into stores, both on Amazon and in bookstores around Nigeria. But Prof, maybe last word on the theme of this conversation, which is how do we make reforms succeed? So maybe in the last 30 seconds, if you can just wrap it up for people who are listening, both in government, civil society, etc. What are some of the key elements that must be in place for reforms to work within the Nigerian context?
Yeah, you got to look at, thank you. You got to look at what kind of reform. It's just like change management in the private sector. You think about what happened with IBM when IBM was in a bad shape after being one of the most successful companies in the world. And they decided that the kind of reform they wanted was, look, these guys, the culture of the guys who have run this company for years needs to change. So they fired the entire leadership. And they went to get somebody who didn't know anything about computers. They went to RPG Nabisco and hired, that was his name, who wrote, Who Says Elephants Can't Dance? Louis Gessner.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's one kind of reform. It's not always going to be that kind of reform. So if you think of reforms that stop the momentum of an organization and the way how you manage the consequences that come from that kind of whole stopping of momentum is different from how you deal with certain culture change, where you have a programmatic change effort, where you have to systematically, let's look at when the banks in this country were going through culture change efforts. Anderson was all over the place, and the young assistant managers in First Bank and AfriBank were wondering what are these guys disturbing our lives for. So you got to have a different approach. And that's why many of those reforms, 70% of them fail. So you got to look at the critical element, the particular kind of reform that you're trying to implement, and therefore align appropriately to achieve the goal that you're looking for. Some reforms are bottom-up change. How do you get the people themselves down there, that the ones closest to the customers or whatever, to be able to say, look, this is the way we think the world is going? Around this is the Mazda story. When Mazda was literally dead as a company, and they were looking for how to go forward. People just thought it was public relations exercise. They didn't believe anybody would read the things. So Mazda then made a statement that whatever it gets to that box, no matter how stupid it is, they'll make an effort to implement. And they got one idea. So I'll just make it a point that what Mazda did assure people that they would actually every idea. And that led to ideas which led Mazda to sending people out to go and look at one of the ideas and led to the building of a hot rod, the Mayata. Long after the world had thought it had come to the end of hot rods. I mean, I remember a time cover story when the last MG was built, you know, and all of that. So it's all going to be a matter of the particular form of reform that you pursue.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much, Professor Utomi, for the time you spent with us on this conversation. Like I said, we're going to send out the video and the notes. So all the places where we had technical glitches, we'll try to, fill in the gaps. Secondly, to say that some of the points we've made here around training for people in public policy, we want to thank Professor Lotta for the work he's doing with the Ibadan School of Government and Public Policy as a place to train administrators, politicians, etc., on how to drive policy reforms. But again, on the policy reforms, in 2 weeks' time, I'll be having another conversation with Dr. Mo Adefeso, who is the founder of the Education Partnership. She's a fellow at the Brookings Institution. And we're going to focus on education policy and the role of private schools for the poor. It's going to be on February 21st, 2 weeks from today, same time, 3 p.m. West Africa time. And hopefully you can join us. And this is all in the bid to keep ideating for Africa's development. So thank you very much for joining us. And we hope you join us next time. Thank you.